You tell your people, Tang, the government is done waiting.
We answer to a higher authority than yours.
They're taking the properties. All of them.
Then everything we built is at risk.
By the late 1880s, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was not just under pressure, it was on the brink of institutional collapse. The United States government had escalated its campaign against plural marriage to an unprecedented level. Church leaders were in hiding. Assets were being seized. Temples, the very center of religious life, were at risk of being taken. At the center of this crisis was a question that would define the future of the church. Could a religious principle once taught as eternal survive under political and legal force? In 1890, a single document would change everything. But what actually happened behind that decision? And did the practice truly end when it was said to? This video examines the documented events, internal tensions, and long-term consequences of what became known as the Manifesto of 1890. Part 1. The breaking point. To understand what 1890 meant, you have to understand what the years before it looked like. Plural marriage, introduced by Joseph Smith in the 1840s, had been a defining and deeply contested feature of early Latter-day Saint theology. Church leaders taught it not merely as a practice, but as a celestial principle. Brigham Young called it essential to exaltation. John Taylor described it as something God had commanded and no government could rightfully take away. For decades, members had endured relentless pressure because of that belief. The Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862 had made polygamy a federal crime. The Poland Act of 1874 expanded federal jurisdiction over Utah courts. The Edmunds Act of 1882 introduced harsher penalties and stripped polygamists of the right to vote, serve on juries, or hold office. But none of those earlier measures had the reach of what came in 1887. The Edmunds-Tucker Act was different in kind and scope. It gave the federal government the authority to seize church property. It dissolved the church's legal corporate structure. It disfranchised women in Utah who had held voting rights since 1870. It required anti-polygamy test oaths for voters, jurors, and public officials. And it targeted the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, the institution that had helped tens of thousands of converts immigrate to Utah, shutting it down entirely. The intent was not just to penalize individuals, it was to dismantle the institution. Federal marshals actively hunted church leaders. The period became known simply as the Raid. Men went underground. Women were questioned. Children were sometimes used as witnesses against their own fathers. President John Taylor, who led the church after Brigham Young's death in 1877, refused to comply. He went into hiding and never returned from it. He died in concealment in 1887, still a fugitive from federal prosecution. When Wilford Woodruff assumed leadership, he did not inherit a church in tension. He inherited a church in crisis. By 1890, federal receivers had taken control of significant church assets. The endowment house in Salt Lake City had already been demolished. There were credible legal threats directed at the Salt Lake Temple itself, which was still under construction. Then, in May 1890, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the late Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints v. United States. The court upheld the constitutionality of the Edmunds-Tucker Act in full. The government could proceed. Woodruff later wrote in his journal that he had prayed intensely about the situation, that he had weighed the destruction of the church against the continuation of the practice, and that what followed was the product of that discernment. But the central investigative question stands. Was the shift that followed a theological decision, or a response to institutional survival? The historical record does not allow a clean answer. It may have been both, but the sequence of events, legal threat, Supreme Court ruling, institutional collapse in progress, makes the institutional dimension impossible to ignore. Part 2. The Manifesto. On September 24, 1890, Wilford Woodruff issued what would later be canonized as Official Declaration 1, known simply as the Manifesto. The document itself is short, fewer than 300 words, and a careful reading reveals something that has long been noted by historians, both inside and outside the church. It was not presented initially as a direct binding revelation. It did not use the language of "Thus saith the Lord." It did not follow the prophetic declaration format of earlier revelations recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants. It was issued as a statement, written in the first person, addressed broadly, and distributed to the press before it was formally presented to the membership. The Associated Press received it. Newspapers across the country published it. The public announcement preceded the ecclesiastical one. The wording inside the document is measured and legally precise. Woodruff did not declare that the principle of plural marriage had been revoked by God. He stated that he advised Latter-day Saints to refrain from contracting marriages forbidden by the law of the land. He stated that the church was not teaching polygamy or encouraging its practice. He cited the legal pressure directly. In October 1890, the document was brought before the General Conference in Salt Lake City. Members were asked to sustain it. What the historical record shows is that the vote was not the result of a spontaneous grassroots consensus. The framing of the vote, the context in which it was presented, and the atmosphere of institutional crisis all shaped how members received it. For some, it was a relief. The years of hiding, prosecution, and social marginalization had been exhausting. For others, it was deeply disorienting. These were people who had sacrificed legally recognized marriage, social standing, and in some cases their freedom, all in defense of a principle they had been told was eternal. They had heard apostles and presidents of the church teach that the United States government would never successfully abolish plural marriage, that God would not allow it. Now they were being asked to sustain a document that said otherwise. The vote to sustain passed, but what it meant, and whether it represented genuine theological acceptance or institutional compliance, was a question that would quietly persist for years. Part 3. Internal conflict and human impact. The formal institutional record tells one story. The personal record tells another. For members who had built plural families, sometimes over decades, the Manifesto was not an abstract doctrinal shift. It was a disruption of lived reality. Women in plural marriages faced a position that the church had not fully prepared them for. Some had no legal standing in their marriages at all, in a society structured around legal monogamy that left them economically and socially exposed. Some continued living quietly with their families, hoping to avoid attention. Others had to make difficult, independent choices about how to move forward. Children born into plural families carried a particular burden. Their legal status was often ambiguous. Their fathers could face prosecution. Their family structure, which they had grown up understanding as righteous, was now publicly condemned by the institution that had taught it was righteous. Within leadership, the record shows that the response was not entirely unified. Personal journals from the period indicate that some apostles struggled with the decision. Not openly, public dissent was not an option. But privately, some questioned whether the principle could truly be set aside by external legal pressure, when earlier prophets had explicitly taught that it could not. This tension was not a minor footnote. John Taylor, just years before his death, had preached explicitly that God would not revoke plural marriage because of government opposition. Brigham Young had said something similar. These were not casual statements. They were delivered as prophetic declarations. The Manifesto required members to hold those earlier declarations alongside a newer institutional position that pointed in the opposite direction. It required a kind of theological reconciliation that, for many, was never fully achieved. And the emotional weight of that did not simply dissolve. What followed in many communities was a quiet grief, not spoken publicly, not processed institutionally, but present in the letters, diaries, and family histories of the people who lived through it. Part 4. The Practice in the Shadows. The Manifesto marked the official public end of plural marriages contracted within the United States. But historical research, including work conducted by LDS historians, has documented that the practice did not immediately stop. In the years following 1890, plural marriages continued to be performed. Many took place in church-established colonies in northern Mexico, Colonia Juarez, Colonia Dublin, and in southern Canada, particularly in Cardston, Alberta. These locations placed the ceremonies technically outside U.S. legal jurisdiction. Some of these marriages were performed with the knowledge, and in some cases the authorization, of senior church leaders. This created a situation that historians have described as a dual reality: public compliance with U.S. law on one side, and private continuation in specific sanctioned contexts on the other. For the members involved, this was not experienced as hypocrisy. Many understood it as faithfulness to a principle they believed God had not actually revoked, only suspended in the American context. But the dual reality could not hold indefinitely. The Reed-Smoot hearings, which began in 1904, brought the issue back into national focus. Smoot, an apostle, had been elected to the United States Senate. His right to serve was challenged on the grounds that the church had not genuinely abandoned polygamy. The hearing stretched across 3 years and produced extensive testimony about ongoing plural marriages. The national attention was damaging. In 1904, Church President Joseph F. Smith issued what became known as the Second Manifesto. Unlike the 1890 statement, this one established explicit institutional consequences. Members who entered into new plural marriages would be subject to excommunication. That enforcement mechanism changed the equation. Over the following years, those who continued the practice were removed from the church. Some went quietly. Others organized independently, forming what became the fundamentalist Mormon splinter groups that continue to exist today. Groups like the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which trace their authority directly to the belief that the original manifesto was a concession to government pressure and not a genuine divine command.
The crisis has passed.
The legacy of 1890. The events of 1890 did more than end a practice. They redefined the relationship between belief, leadership, and external pressure, and that redefinition has never fully resolved. The manifesto allowed the church to avoid financial and legal destruction. It opened the path toward Utah statehood, which was granted in 1896. It allowed the institution to begin the long process of integration into mainstream American society, a process that would define much of 20th century Mormonism. But it also introduced questions that have never fully closed. When a practice is taught as eternal, as divinely commanded and permanently sealed into doctrine, and then reversed under political and legal force, what does that say about the nature of revelation? What does it say about the relationship between prophetic authority and institutional survival? These are not fringe questions raised only by critics. They appear in the journals of apostles. They surface in the Smoot hearings. They echo in the formation of every fundamentalist group that emerged from that period, each claiming that the original revelation was the real one and the reversal was the human compromise. The transition of 1890 was not simple or immediate. It was complex, contested, and for many, deeply disruptive. It was managed publicly and complicated privately. And it left a theological tension embedded in the institution that has never been entirely explained away. Understanding 1890 is essential, not just for understanding Mormon history, but for understanding how modern Latter-day Saint identity was constructed. Because this was not just a moment of institutional adjustment. It was a turning point that forced the church to define, perhaps for the first time at this scale, how it navigates the collision between divine mandate and earthly power. And that question did not end in 1890. It is still being answered. If you've been following this channel, you already know these aren't simple stories. The history of the LDS Church is full of moments like this one, decisions made under pressure, taught as doctrine, and later reframed. If you want to understand how those moments connect, subscribe and stay with us. And drop a comment below. Do you think the manifesto was a revelation or a political calculation? We read every response.